to this brief Bible dive with Beautiful Savior Lutheran Church in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and with me, Pastor Nick. We're in this brief Bible dive series where we're summarizing books of the Bible so that you can get a quick understanding of their message and why they matter. Sometimes these are books that are a little bit obscure, and today we're talking about the writings of the prophet Hosea. So in one of the more bizarre requests that God made to somebody in the Bible, God told Hosea that he should go and marry a prostitute. The marriage was to serve as a living, breathing symbol that God's people, the people of Israel, had broken their covenant with God, and they had been unfaithful because they were worshiping idols. So in other words, Hosea the prophet and his family were to be a living symbol of how the people were kind of spiritually prostituting themselves by worshiping gods that were not the living God, just things made out of human hands. Centuries earlier, God entered into this covenant with the people of Israel. God promised that God would be their God. They would be God's people. God would take care of them. But they had to obey these certain laws that God gave. And one of those laws was don't have any idols. Well, God, of course, fulfilled the agreement, but the people of Israel did not. So throughout much of their history, they were not acting as God's people. They didn't follow these laws, but God did not give up on them. So before invoking this sort of a clause in the agreement, it's like a punishment clause in this agreement, God had these prophets who spent time giving messages to the people, urging them, just to, begging them to come back to God, begging them to come back to God, and warning them, of course, that if they didn't, something bad would happen. But the people treated the prophets with the same disrespect that they had shown God and God's law. As Jesus would put it, while standing in the capital, Jerusalem, about 700 years after Hosea, it's 700, give or take a few years, he said, quote, "The people have killed the prophets and stoned the messengers sent to these people." Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets. Yet the story of Hosea, it's not mainly about rebellion against God or spiritual rebellion or even divine punishment. It's actually about God's unbelievable love, just this relentless drive and love for God's own people who even treated God like God was the enemy. So for those who think that the Old Testament, they say, well, I have a New Testament God and an Old Testament God. No, same God. And so sometimes people are like, well, the Old Testament God is cruel and the New Testament God, I don't know, it's kind of like this like hippie love kind of person. Again, same God. So Hosea is clear about this. Hosea revealed this sort of preview, this sense that we're going to get, and we will learn it more through Jesus, but a sense that God is practicing compassion. God is a God of love. God is a God that is there saying, love your enemies. And of course, one of the enemies is, well, the people that say they're not actually going to love God anymore. They're not going to follow the rules. So for this reason, the story of Hosea begins with God's this unusual request from God for Hosea to go out and marry a prostitute. And the story continues. Hosea does what God asks, marries a prostitute named Gomer. And during the marriage, Gomer had 3 children, 2 sons and 1 daughter. Although even in the book of Hosea, the writings of Hosea, it's kind of interesting because only the first child is clearly from her husband, Hosea. We don't know for sure how the other 2 were fathered. But anyways, they all became part of this living symbol of the marriage. Hosea even named the children according to the fate of Israel that they would eventually have. The first child was named Jezreel, which means God scatters. The second child was named Lo Ruhama, which means no mercy. That's a little tough. Imagine being named that as a kid. And then the third child was named Lo Ami, which means not my people. Actually, when you think about it, which kids would want any of these names? But why would Hosea name his children such horrible sounding names? Because because it's kind of tough stuff. But here's why: because they were symbolic of the consequence of Israel's unfaithfulness to God. If the people failed to honor the agreement between them and God, God had the right to scatter them among the nations, first child, show them no mercy, second child, and disown them, third child's name. Hosea's marriage, the family, it served as a daily reminder to the people around him about the sins of the nation and the consequences that the people would suffer if they did not change their ways. But believe it or not, the story gets even weirder in Hosea. Gomer decided to leave her husband, Hosea, and the family, apparently to return to her trade of prostitution. At this point, God gave another bizarre request to Hosea. God told Hosea hey, Hosea, go fall in love with Gomer again. This was all in order to show that God still loves Israel. He was a model of God's love for Israel. God still loves Israel, even though the people went after other idols, other gods. So by this time, Gomer was living with another man. Maybe she provided, I don't know. We don't know why. Maybe he got there was an income from the prostitution or whatever, but the Bible doesn't actually say, but whatever the relationship, we know that Gomer somehow became enslaved. And at this point, Hosea had to financially buy her back from this other man because she was enslaved. The price of the purchase was 15 silver coins and 10 bushels of grain. I mean, modern ears, okay, fine, right? We don't quite get that thing, but 15 silver coins, 10 bushels of grain. Well, this act on Hosea's part, because he did buy her back, was a reminder of how powerful God's love for Israel was and is. And then we see it play out 700 years later when Jesus was sent to those people of Israel as one of the people of Israel. Hosea tells us that even in the midst of God's warnings, and even if Israel failed to turn back its ways, God promised that there would be a day when the people of Israel would be called quite the opposite of those three names. They'd be called children of the living God. They'd be called my people. They'd be called shown mercy. There'd be a day when they would return home and enjoy the rich blessings of God. Jesus, God's own son, was sent to Israel to warn them again, except this time they were purchased out of slavery and captivity to sin. And how? With the price not of coins and bushels of whatever, but through Jesus' own blood, through his death on the cross. So, as we see through Hosea, God persisted about loving God's own people, God's children, and God would not let them go. We have to think about this ourselves. We really do. I don't use the word have to often, a phrase, but we do, because none of us have lived perfect lives. And to be blunt, we all have, in one way or another, given ourselves into other gods, little g gods, Gods. Perhaps our gods aren't the idols of the Old Testament. We're not worshiping like a physical thing sitting on our desk. Although maybe we do, but there are certainly idols in our lives that demand our attention, whether it be money or prestige or whatever else, or our professional career, our what people think of us. But these things seem to demand that we place our attention first with them before with God, the living God, the true God, the one who created us and saved us. So while you're listening to this, maybe you have in mind something that you're not especially proud of, something you've done, something you've failed to do. Well, know that God is still after you. That's the message of Hosea. God still wants you. And as Jesus showed, God literally loved you to death on the cross. So we have a God who chooses to be faithful to us, even if we've not done the best job of being faithful in return. That is the message delivered in this little book, this little set of writings that we call Hosea. So that's the writings of the prophet Hosea in a nutshell. To learn more about our congregation, go to bslcmi.org. We'd love for you to share this video, subscribe, and like it. Now go out and love God and love your neighbors.